Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. Good to be back with all of you. It's been a few weeks and summer is kind of winding down. It's got a few more weeks left, at least in our house, before our kids go back to school. And it's been a time of vacation and rest and also some work. And that's the stuff that's happening in my world. And I know, Darren, you and I like to catch up, and it feels, even though it's only been about 3 weeks or so since we last recorded, it feels a lot longer, and that's probably because I just got to separate myself from the day-to-day and go spend some time in some beautiful national parks out in the upper Midwest. Had a wonderful time doing that. So all that said, how are you doing? How are things going? You enjoying the summer so far? I know you're busy with lots of different projects, so what's going on with you?
Yeah, I'm definitely enjoying the summer, but also looking forward to the fall for sure. I think today was actually a bit of a downturn in terms of temperature. So I'm looking forward to, upper 70s, low 80s for the next few days. For a while there, we had a bit of a heat dome over the southeast, probably while you were away. So looking forward to some cooler temperatures. And as is usually the case, at least the last few years, 2 or 3 years, July and August for me ends up being kind of a time to let the land lay fallow, as they say, as I kind of meditate on what wants to emerge in the fall. So I have a much stronger sense of that, what I'm going to be offering in terms of essence of being. And I know you and I are going to riff together over pizza on intentional communities and that kind of thing. And looking forward to something else that's going to arise in September that I'll have more to say about in a few weeks' time. But all told, yeah, really enjoying the summer and gearing up for what's coming in the fall.
Excellent. Yeah, it's there's a lot of stuff on the horizon here, and I think the world has been very busy with a lot of different sometimes chaotic activities. We had that earthquake that happened just last week, and that was quite a panic, I think, for coastal communities that were potentially affected by the tsunami. And it just reminds you, when you see footage like that and you see earthquake, the ground shaking like it does, and if you've lived through one, you recognize that we are subservient to some larger forces that we have very little control over, and that can feel really chaotic and unmooring and a little bit scary even. But at the same time, we have a lot that we can be grateful for, and my wife and I talk about that all the time. As much as we want to gripe about this, that, or the other, we have so much we can be grateful for. If we just focus on those wonderful things and be grateful, it changes your perspective and really does help ground you, I think, into where you are, and helps you, I think, be in a position to act, right? To act, as you say, with responsibility. And I think that's such an important factor in the world in which we find ourselves. So amongst the many things that have been going on in the world, of course, there are lots of news bites, sound bites in the UFO space over the last 3 weeks. So there is a lot of activity to kind of dive into here. Want to go through some of these, Darren, to kind of get your take on them. One of the more recent ones that I think happened just a few days ago was the reintroduction of the UAP Disclosure Act, or some language related to that, to be, I think, included with the NDAA. But it was reintroduced by Senator Schumer and Rounds, and I think Gillibrand even signed on to this one this time. We've heard positive things from Matt Laszlo, who's done a lot of reporting on the Hill, that there was no pushback with this language when it went through the Senate. Of course, it has to make its way into the House eventually, and they have to agree to include that in the NDAA. And that's where we know historically there's been a lot of pushback. So this is the third time we've tried to get this language pushed through, and it doesn't seem to be all that different. A lot of the same provisions are there. A lot of the same language related to non-human intelligence is there. Technologies of unknown origin. Of course, the horse that we like to keep beating, the eminent domain component, which is really kind of a sticking point for many people. So that's, I think, very exciting. It tells me that, Rounds and Schumer and Gillibrand and others are still okay pushing this topic forward. They haven't forgotten about it. And the fact that they continue to push it forward, even though it's failed 2 times previously, tells me that it's still a very serious thing. If it weren't serious, they would have dropped it long ago. Why spend any political capital trying to get this passed? So really quite interesting there. But Darren, what are your thoughts on this? Are you optimistic that it might get through this time, or do you think there's still some obstacles ahead before we'll see passage?
Well, I think that while some of the people that you named have been instrumental in terms of putting this legislation forward, I know, and I think you know, other people know as well, that there are other people behind the scenes that have been kind of agents of trying to orchestrate this all. Carl Nell being one of those. And as I've said in different places, different podcasts, he has been instrumental in trying to put together a disclosure plan, a managed disclosure plan, which both softens the soil for this to be engaged with by our society, as well as putting together some elements that will allow the government to disclose things in a legal way. So he's basically championing this idea that while there has been some malfeasance here historically, he's trying to find a way for the government to come clean through usual legislation, basically, to allow this to happen. So he's both working to soften the soil with academics, with the media, with those kinds of things, while also working with people on the back end so that there is a way, a legislative path forward, basically, to let this happen, dealing with things like, for instance, if people have signed non-disclosure agreements in history, they would be exempt from those according to this new kind of language. So I think he sees it, and I tend to agree with him, as the legitimate path forward to some kind of disclosure. We've been into this many times now. What actually would be disclosed? That's an open and ongoing question. But I think my perspective is something like this does have to come into law before we will see major movement. Otherwise, it's going to be more of the same, I think, over the next few years. So I know he and others were quite discouraged when it didn't get passed the first couple times, or when it did, it was heavily gutted. But if this does pass largely intact, because as you said, there has to be some sort of reconciliation, if that happens and it passes largely intact, then I think we really have major movement and we have now a way forward. If it doesn't pass, then I think there's an open question, what path forward is there, basically? Because you've got kind of this logjam right now where some of the whistleblowers want to come forward, but they have not seen actions from Congress, from their government, to make them feel comfortable that it's safe for them to do so. And saying, yeah, come on down and talk to us, while at the same time letting organizations like Arrow get involved, that to many people within our community look like not a good faith actor, might be part of an extension of the very gatekeeping itself. So until something does happen, until we have a legislative path that's clear and create some protections for some of those whistleblowers, I don't think we're going to have the revelations that will allow this to really be engaged with by the mainstream, which is what people usually mean when they say disclosure. They don't want to just have someone make some sort of comment. They want their neighbors, their friends, their family to go, oh, this is real. What does it mean? Let's engage with this. I think some of that legislative path has to come into fruition for that to happen.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we can debate about the merits of the legislation and, whether it should include this or not include that. I think that's, a healthy conversation to have, but getting something on the books is the most important component. And, you can understand why whistleblowers like Michael Herrera, shared his frustration, because these whistleblowers are putting a lot on the line. They recognize the public wants to know, they want to tell their stories, like you said, but they don't feel like they have the protections that they need to, either secure their financial futures or their family's safety or their own safety. And without those protections in place, then you're really asking a great deal of them without any, safety guarantees on their part. So I can understand why they'd be really hesitant to do that. That said, I know that some of them will probably step forward regardless and will be, daring enough to try to push this forward. But, as we all know, how many more whistleblowers do we really need? I think that's kind of a question, an open question I ask. We have a lot of folks that want to see that firsthand whistleblower. They've had contact with the craft, they worked on the projects, they've seen the biologics. We'd love to have that kind of firsthand testimony. We've gotten pretty much close to that, if not that exactly, with many whistleblowers in the past, and that hasn't necessarily moved the needle in a significant way. So I think getting this legislation passed in conjunction with additional testimony, additional hearings, which we've heard there will be hearings, or as a planned hearing at least in September. How will that hearing coincide with the final vote on this legislation? That'll be very interesting. It would be quite surprising if we had some bombastic whistleblower testimony in a hearing and then it didn't get passed. That would be even more telling. that there might be some forces behind the scenes really trying to put the brakes on this disclosure process. But we'll see. There's a lot in motion, and I always remind myself, and I think folks need to kind of keep this in mind too, that what you see in the social media conversation is not at all what's taking place behind the scenes with folks that are working day in and day out to try to push this forward. There's a lot of stuff going on really to kind of move this in a future direction from people that you've never even heard of. And that really gives me comfort. There's a lot of activity there, even if I might feel like there isn't at certain times. But other than that, we've got a lot of other interesting things happening that have been shared. One that really caught my eye, very excited about, was this paper that was published by Dr. Beatrice Villarreal on the historical astronomical plates and observations of the night sky, particularly in conjunction with nuclear testing and these transient lights that would appear often in conjunction with that testing, either before or after the testing. And then there's a sort of a high degree of the sigma on this, I think was extremely high, which tells me that the statistical likelihood of this just being kind of a fluke is very, very low. So it seems very promising, and it's going to be going through additional, kind of technical analysis and review by peers and whatnot. But I'm excited that that's really some tangible evidence that we might be able to say, look, there's no way this could have been satellites because it was before we had satellites in the sky. So what could it possibly be? Maybe this will be another good piece of evidence to further strengthen this argument that this is something we should be taking very seriously. But Darren, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is quite promising. And I made a social media post last week talking about this. I said, there's at least 3 different ways I can imagine something like disclosure coming into fruition. One would be some announcement from a podium. I don't think that's likely anytime soon. Secondly, we could have NHI themselves showing up in a really direct and unambiguous way. The third, though, is that just the sheer preponderance of data reaches a sufficient threshold that people begin to engage with it differently. And it basically becomes this turning point where we accept that this is real. So I think this study here represents that third option. And many people are not that interested because it doesn't sound as sensationalistic as a triangle over the White House or something like that. But this is data rich, and I think that is something that gives it promise to actually be accepted, engaged with by academia. So let me just give some details of this just for those who maybe are not so familiar. So she and her team detected what looked like a vast network of artificial objects in high Earth orbit between the years, and this is the key part, as you said, between 1949 and 1958, which is years before Sputnik, which is the first human satellite in orbit that we're aware of. If confirmed, this is not a single UFO or stray satellite. This is an entire surveillance grid, and the implications would be enormous, really. So the authors looked at mysterious, short-lived star-like objects, which they called transients, found in sky photos from the Palomar Observatory between 1949 and 1957. Now, what's interesting is that these objects showed up only in one photo, were gone in earlier and later photos, and had no known stars or satellites at those positions when they would cross-check that. So this raises real questions around what this could be. And again, it's not one here or there, but it kind of plays into this notion that there might be this ancient and really sophisticated surveillance network, and we just never really noticed it up until now. And I know you and I have had conversations before that with the advent of AI, we're going to be able to look back at the historical record and find maybe smoking guns in plain sight that we just never quite saw before. That will both be, I think, in newspaper articles and government documents that kind of get pieced together by AI. But it's also things like this, like black and white footage we have from the 20th century that shows some of these objects. If this does get through scrutiny, right, as you pointed out, it's now going through peer review. If the peers come forward and say, we're not going to acknowledge what this is necessarily, we're not going to say this is a UFO or this is alien intelligence, but it is legitimately something that is in orbit, high Earth orbit on top of that, that does seem to be there 1 second and gone the next. Now, a key element, too, that I think is worth pointing out is that they also check this against nuclear activity, like when we were detonating bombs, and UFO sightings. And what they found was there was a positive correlation there. In other words, these transients, as they're called, were more likely to show up when there had been a nuclear test. So they would see a disproportionate number of these the day of, the day before, the day after a nuclear test. They also saw that this also correlated in higher numbers when there was a UFO sighting. In other words, if someone reported a UFO, if multiple people did, one of these transients would have been spotted the day before or after as well. And the most common occurrence was when there was a nuclear test and a UFO sighting, then even more so, these transients would show up disproportionately so. So that's fascinating, of course, because again, that at least tangentially connects it to the UFO phenomenon and also connects it to this history of the dawn of the atomic era and how we did seem to see, at least anecdotally, an uptick in the number of sightings and engagement from potential NHI. So here we might have some hard data suggesting that very thing. So when I bring that up, what comes to mind for you in terms of the legitimacy of this and what this might do potentially to move the ball down the proverbial field?
Yeah, I think it's very positive. I think, like you said, if it does pass peer review and is taken seriously, it's going to cause quite a conversation. So really important work that they're doing there. And, it would seem to be very difficult to debunk something like that if the science is very sound and the evidence is very sound there to show that these are real objects, that they are in Earth orbit, and they're not stars, they're not comets, they're not meteorites. That would be a big deal. So very excited to see that. It also makes me think about, sort of current astronomical news, and that's that 3I Atlas interstellar object that we're tracking coming from outside of our solar system. A lot of buzz around that one, of course. Avi Loeb certainly weighing in on, what it might be, potentially be. We're continuing to take measurements of that object, and I think it's going to be closest to us, I want to say in October. But maybe additional measurements will be able to take place in the next few weeks to get further clarity on what it might be. So that's also potentially interesting. If nothing else to say, like we're looking for these kinds of objects now in ways that we haven't before, and we're starting to fine-tune our science and our analysis to think a little bit differently about what is in our skies, what is in, our surrounding neighborhood of our solar system, and what should be there or shouldn't be there. So a lot of interesting stuff happening there in that space. I think it's an important component to this overall conversation because it does bring individuals into the conversation who are in those fields or have particular interest in those fields that wouldn't have any interest at all in the traditional UFO story or narrative. So quite interesting stuff. But speaking of space, there was another sort of podcast recently, and I can't remember the name of the gentleman who was on the podcast, but he used to work for NASA and used to do some contracting work for, I think, some special access programs, if I remember correctly. And he was explaining that, in the course of his work with his companies, that they were routinely given material that would be collected, various different locations, and that material showed signs of intelligent design, that it wasn't just sort of random sort of dust or rocks or whatever, that it had some sort of intelligent design and manufacture. It had, qualities that, as he described, were qualities of materials that we wouldn't have now or wouldn't have for hundreds of years. And the other claim that he made that was quite fascinating to me was there might be trillions of these types of objects around the Earth, and that he happened to know how you might be able to find them, to look for them. So very interesting interview that I think really came out of left field, but from a seemingly reputable source here, maybe more willing to talk about this than he would have been a couple of decades before. I don't know his age, but he sounded like he might be an older gentleman, so maybe he's more comfortable speaking about this now. But another example, again, of just somebody who's been involved with this, who's now comfortable speaking about it and is raising a lot of eyebrows with these claims. So, Darren, what are your thoughts on that, and what particulars of that podcast did I miss that you want to sort of detail out for us?
Yeah, it was pretty fascinating. It was actually a NASA-affiliated podcast, and I know people within our community have since then said, okay, podcasters, hurry up and get this guy on so we can ask him some more questions. But what he's saying is definitely consequential and relates to the UFO phenomenon, and also relates to this notion of this kind of vast surveillance network that might have been around the planet for as long as we basically have been around, certainly since we've been recording these things. So his name is Richard Ben Durek, and he's an aerospace engineer. He worked both for NASA and Lockheed Systems. And he basically said, quote, "We found trillions of them all over the world." And this is interesting because, again, this is not on a UFO podcast. This is on a NASA-related podcast. another longer quote he said was that, quote, "We were looking at very little things that seemed to deposit all over the world. There were probably trillions of these things, and they have all sorts of functions. We assumed they're everywhere. The ones that would work, we would never be able to find because they would cloak themselves or reconfigure. Not all of them are functional." So this is pretty fascinating because this wasn't a sci-fi script. This is a guy who's having a technical conversation on a NASA-affiliated podcast talking about these things. So this definitely begs the question, what's going on here? And when he talks about not just the fact that these things existed, but they could cloak themselves and reconfigure themselves is truly fascinating. And I think too about some footage I saw that was some of the most compelling footage I ever saw, which I know I mentioned to you. When I was at that private retreat at the Monroe Institute, there was some footage that was smuggled out of South America, basically. And one of them involved this craft that landed. It was basically hovering above the ground in kind of an industrial zone. And then before your eyes, you see this craft transfigure into a completely different shape and then take off into the sky. And I've had people ask me, do you mean like it transformed instantaneously? And I said, there was some sort of reconfiguring, almost like a transformer kind of thing that you might see in Transformers, those who are familiar with that show. But it happened so fast, it's hard to know with a naked eye what's actually going on there. But I saw both clear footage of this thing. It wasn't super high definition. It was security cam footage, as you probably know, not necessarily super high definition, but you can clearly see this thing hovering over this industrial zone, footage taken from a security camera, basically. It transfigured into some completely different shape and then took off with incredible speed off the camera. So that reminds me of this when he talks about reconfiguring and cloaking and things like that. So these pieces together seem to not only be interesting in their own right, but taken together, it seems to, again, push us closer to that threshold where people recognize that there's something really going on here, that humans have not been alone. Not just that we are not alone, but that we have not been alone. And that even more consequentially, there may be a species and intelligence that has not only just been dropping in once in a while, but perhaps has been surveilling us with a vast surveillance network for as long as we can remember, basically. If that's true, then the consequences are, I think, quite dramatic in terms of this notion of either a prison planet or a school or a species that's basically cattle to, or an experiment of some more sophisticated civilization. These are the kind of questions that I think inevitably rise to the surface when we come across these kinds of revelations. So I'm looking forward to see where all of this goes. And of course, what's also interesting, and I know you and I have talked about this, is that part of the challenge is there are many different kinds of phenomena that get lumped in together as the UFO phenomenon. We have groups like Skywatcher, which I know we're going to discuss in a second, seemingly identified plasmoid type intelligences or organisms, which might actually be completely natural byproducts of the Earth environment, basically. But we also have these seemingly mechanical objects like the surveillance network, the spheres, the orbs, that kind of thing. And we also have the notion of beings that seem to be not just physical, but even paraphysical, as Jacques Vallée will discuss, which I know we're going to get into later. But there's a lot going on here, and I think sometimes we do a disservice to the data when we try to lump it in and call it one thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. Really fascinating stuff there, and it makes me think too of the stories that we've heard in the past of implants, right? Implants that have been behaving in very similar ways, difficult to detect, evading surgical procedure, moving on their own volition. We've heard a lot of stories about that from various sources. So there's, as I like to think about this, people say there's no evidence, there's no proof for any of this stuff, but there's so many stories like this over the many decades from reputable sources that make me think this isn't just, sort of a fantasy, that there's something really happening here, and that there's been a long, as many have alleged, a very long, very sophisticated cover-up and sort of active tamping down of interest of this subject for various reasons, and we can get into some of those reasons a little later. But to your point about the complexity of it all, I think that's really one that we shouldn't, gloss over. It's we really don't have a complete notion of what we're dealing with in totality, but we want to collapse it into something that is very easy to understand, simplistic, and easily digestible. I think that's something we really have to avoid doing as much as we possibly can until we know more, right? We need to avoid trying to collapse this down into one singular thing and keep a very wide open mind about what this might be and where it might be coming from, because it could be multiple different sources and dimensions and all kinds of things that we're just not really aware of. Because again, our understanding of our reality is very limited. So for us to sort of make, I think, grand claims as to what this might be is very, very, very premature. So very interesting stuff to explore there further. You did mention Skywatcher, and it's funny, I was thinking the other day, I haven't heard from those guys, and they were, they came out of the gate this year, really quick and saying, like, we're going to provide all this evidence and information, and we're going to be really transparent with people, and it's going to be fantastic, and there's a lot of buzz. And then it just really didn't develop in that way at all, as oftentimes these things do. People have really good intentions, but it can be much harder to, I think, produce the evidence that they think they might be able to get, or they may be unwilling to share it in the ways in which we might want them to share it, which could be a different way of characterizing this. But, there have been a lot of rumors about Skywatcher. There have been like Reddit leaks, and there's been like a footage leak of these tetrahedrons that was a legitimate leak of Skywatcher footage, and a lot of just kind of rumor mill stuff about what are they doing, and are they legitimate, and are they working with the government, and what's going on there. Well, they did release a statement just recently, and that certainly caught my eye and was good for them to, I think, get out in front of some of these comments and the rumor mill, try to set the record straight. But as you can see from the statements, and I think you may have those, it's a lot, murkier than it might seem. Like, there's a lot going on. It's very complicated. It's not as simple as we would like it to be. And it's clear they're still working. They're still doing things. But as far as like when we're going to see additional tangible, kind of results of their efforts, it's going to be a little while longer. Although they did hint that they have their part 3 basically in the edit room, and part 3 is focusing heavily on the psionic component. So I'm very excited about that. What they're going to share on the psionic front. But, Darren, what are your thoughts on that? Were you also feeling kind of frustrated with the lack of information from them? Do you think it's going to be a legitimate avenue of further information, or do you think it's eventually just kind of going to get captured by various government interests and maybe the technology bought up and squirreled away?
Well, I'm definitely, in a general sense, encouraged by these different citizen movements to try to capture data directly. We have friends who are also trying to develop technologies. One of our friends has put together technology where you pair video footage with an EEG reading of a human's brain as they're interacting with this thing. I think that's really, really promising kind of technological innovation that will allow us to not only capture footage, but multi-sensory footage, and even understand what's happening in human consciousness to some degree as people are interacting with this kind of technology or whatever is out there in terms of the phenomena. So I think, generally speaking, that's a really positive trend. I think that we shouldn't just lean on the government to give us the information. We have really advanced sensor systems ourselves. We have AI systems that are incredibly advanced that even the government didn't have 5 years ago. So I think we should put these to use in trying to capture some of this footage. And Skywatcher seemingly seems to be one of those groups. I know there's some ongoing questions about potentially some connections with the IC, knowing some of these guys, Jake Barber being one of them, worked in official capacity. I think some people have ongoing questions, but for the most part, I think that they're well-meaning and that this is intended to bring disclosure from citizens for the citizens, basically. And speaking of that press release they produced, let me just quote from that so we can sort of be aware of what they're saying. So it says, quote, "The Skywatcher team is continuing to aggressively collect data and move through the process outlined in the Discovery Framework. We've now engaged multiple high-quality independent third-party groups to provide a thorough scientific analysis." That, of course, speaks to the peer review kind of process that we discussed earlier. "We are attempting to condense a scientific process that usually takes well over a year into a few short months." So again, that speaks to perhaps people's impatience that this does take some time. "Please understand that the corpus of data that we've collected is extremely large. We appreciate your patience as this work proceeds. And then our objective remains the same. And moving forward, we will create a clearer delineation between media releases and formal scientific analyses. Please ignore unsubstantiated claims or gossip, perhaps speaking to the leak you heard about there, which historically has done this entire space an immense disservice. And then they end with part 3 on psionics is completed and going through the appropriate editing and review process. We're confident you will all really enjoy it. More very soon, ! So some key elements there. They're talking about the fact that doing hard science does take some time. It's expensive. You have to get it put through peer review. That also can be incredibly time consuming, actually. I have friends I know in academic circles who've written papers and had to wait a year or more to have it go through peer review. So they're trying to speed up the process, but it does speak to the fact that we should have more patience, understanding that they are trying to not just present sensational claims and even footage, but do it in a really thoughtful way, a really comprehensive way, so that this will see some traction in academic circles potentially. So I think that's the right approach, and I'm very much encouraged by this and looking forward to seeing what they come up with.
Yeah, I agree. I think, we can be kind of a fickle audience sometimes. We want that information right away. Give me that footage. But then when the footage gets released, you immediately also hear, where's the scientific data about this? And, it's just video. And so I'm really frustrated by that. So you can't really have both, folks. I think if we want high quality, well vetted information, it takes time. Unfortunately, it takes time. And hopefully we'll get some really good info from them when the time is right, and they'll have covered all their bases and gotten good feedback on the data that they have. And I'm sure it is a lot of data. I'm sure it's probably, terabytes of information that they're collecting and having to sift through. That can take quite a bit of time. So good luck to them. Hopefully we'll hear something from them in the not too distant future. Much looking forward to that. We've also heard recently that I guess, the drones are still back in the conversation. I saw something, I think it was this morning even, that, there's still rumor that drones are appearing and coming out of the ocean and flying over New Jersey. And that seems to be still taking place. So very curious activity there. I guess TBD on that, if we're going to get any more information from it. I certainly don't think we're going to hear anything from the government on the drone situation. But we've also heard that drones were spotted on other military locations as well. I think the Liberation Times published an article not too long ago about that as well, corroborating that drone sightings were very much taking place in places that we didn't know they were taking place. So it's still a thing. Drones are still a thing, and until we have more information, I think they'll remain a thing. But we'll hopefully get more clarity on that in the future. At least I hope we will. But other than that, Darren, we wanted to shift gears a little bit, right? Talk a little bit about, I think, a little bit of our ufological history and how that history has shaped our current understanding of the phenomena, as well as discuss this notion we hinted at earlier, which is this tendency that we all have to come up with a one singular thing hypothesis for what the phenomena is, and whether or not that is a valid approach to really understanding what it is. So I don't know how you want to set the table for this, but I'm eager to get into the conversation.
To that end, we're going to be discussing Jacques Vallée's groundbreaking trailblazing book, Passport to Magonia, today. It's very easy to, with hindsight, to look back and just take this book as something that's part of the conversation and it kind of being accepted as part of our history. But I think sometimes in doing that, we underestimate and gloss over just how groundbreaking this book was when it came out. Because what he was proposing here was pretty revolutionary. Because at the time, of course, you had ufologists who were trying to see this gain traction in the mainstream, which is to say they were looking to see this being accepted as a true technological phenomenon, likely being an advanced, sophisticated non-human intelligence, i.e. space aliens, that were basically flying spacecraft around in our skies. And what Jacques Vallée suggested was very much a left turn from that perspective, because he pulled together a corpus of data that most people thought was completely separate kinds of data. And so many of us will know now, looking back, that we as a UFO community often talk about everything from the jinn to fairy lore to the notion of extraterrestrials to interdimensionals to cryptids to Sasquatch, all these things, even dino beavers, thinking back to skinwalkers at the Pentagon, right? This all gets tossed in as somehow part of the same quote-unquote phenomenon. Now, yes, to highlight what I said earlier, I think we do have to be careful not to just limit the complexity so that we can come up with a simple solution, I think that kind of defeats the purpose. But in that process, we also should be willing to consider how different aspects of data might be evidence of the same kind of thing, especially if, as Vallée is suggesting here, perhaps this intelligence is playing with our intelligence, interacting with our consciousness, not just individually, but collectively, so as to actually steer the trajectory of our consciousness and the future of our species. Then you might understand why they would look differently over time. And then you might ask questions like, do we see a clear progression in terms of how they show up, or is it completely random? And I think you can make the argument, and people like Vallée have made the argument, along with others, that there is a clear progression where you see this technological marvel kind of appear in our skies, and it always looked like the next generation of what's present then. So, of course, we had the airships in the end of the 19th century, for instance, that looked bizarre, but still looked like something that we might have within 10 or 20 years. Since then, people have looked back, and even Vallée has pointed this out, and said there's no way those things were actually functioning the way they look like they were functioning. But what you can definitely say is that they were showing up in such a way as to excite our imagination and potentially even steer our technological kind of innovation. Then, of course, later on, we had flying saucers. Then we had things like black triangles. And now we have this notion of a tic-tac-like object. Pairing that, of course, with psionic activity. So one thing we didn't talk about that's worth bringing up here is that one of the more recent revelations from Ross Coulthart is that he wanted to clarify that not all tic-tacs are just Lockheed Martin technology. There are apparently some tic-tacs that are being operated by NHI, but that furthermore, the tic-tac that was operated in that famous case with the Nimitz, he's saying he's heard was being operated remotely via a psionic asset. In other words, a human being that was using psionic capacity to basically control this craft. So, as I was saying to you before we started recording, if we had heard that collection of statements even 5 years ago, that would have blown the lid off everything. There's so many elements there that stretch consensus reality. And yet this is where we are in this conversation right now. And of course, this raises the question that this might speak to the kind of cooperation we've talked about and David Grush has talked about. Maybe there is some sort of cooperation here between NHI and elements of our military operating these things. But again, the overarching point being that we're seeing this clear progression where these things seem more technologically sophisticated over time, and they seem to be operating just at the very edges of what we can imagine coming into being. So I think back even to Luis Elizondo, when he came out and said that, yes, these things are hyper-advanced, but most of this we think we could develop within about 50 years. And then as you'll remember, we did a early podcast episode at a soccer field, if you remember, where we talked about the fact that Hal Puthoff had come to people like Luis Elizondo and said, if this formula is true, then suddenly all of the 5 observables are explainable by this one formula, which we think we're getting close to being able to actualize in terms of technology, certainly within 50 years. And of course, we have people that bring in the future human technology kind of notion. You brought up in our last podcast, what if the Tic Tac is Lockheed Martin technology from 2050 or something? That comes in here, right? That these issues get really complex once you start considering all these things. But maybe we'll kick off there and I'll get your feedback, because one of the more interesting aspects when you try to pair together fairy lore with the notion of gray aliens is that there actually is some overlap. It's not just that they're strange beings that are not human that do seem intelligent, but even the very activity they conduct is similar. And we'll draw attention to some of those elements later. But let me first get your take on just what seems like, in our perspective when we look at it historically, a clear progression in technological innovation that somehow might be paired with the very innovation we've been enacting as a species.
Yeah, I think the main thing that I come away with there is there's a calibration process that seems to be taking place. And you can think about this from the standpoint of if you are interacting with someone that maybe doesn't know your language, like you can't speak the same language, and maybe you have a different frame of reference for what is possible. If you're trying to get something across to that other individual, you're trying to communicate with them, have meaningful exchange of information, you've got to go through a series of calibrations in order for them to be able to understand exactly what you're saying. So you're going to have to sort of use symbology, cause and effect, introduce a new terminology that they then have to learn and associate that with a specific action or function. And then once you go through all that process, well, then you can have a meaningful conversation. So it's a calibration. It's a bringing them up in order for you to communicate with them and have a meaningful exchange of information. So if you look at our history in that way as a type of calibration exercise, it becomes a little bit more interesting, and I think relates to exactly what you're talking about, that this intelligence or these intelligences, what they may be doing is helping us reorient and recalibrate our understanding, our ontological perspective, so that we can meaningfully engage with them. You can't just engage with them right away because there's no Rosetta Stone to do that. There's no translation process. So it's a long process of really developing that ability. There's a quote that I found on the book that I wanted to read. I think really kind of hits home some of this stuff. So I'm going to read that out loud really quickly. So it says, it would be nice to hold on to the common belief that the UFOs are craft from a superior space civilization, because this is a hypothesis science fiction has made widely acceptable, and because we are not altogether unprepared scientifically and even perhaps militarily to deal with such visitors. Unfortunately, however, the theory that flying saucers are material objects from outer space manned by a race originating on some other planet is not a complete answer. However strong the current belief in saucers from space, it cannot be stronger than the Celtic faith in the elves and the fairies, or the medieval belief in lutins, or the fear throughout the Christian lands in the first centuries of our era of demons and satyrs and fauns. Certainly, it cannot be stronger than the faith that inspired the writers of the Bible, a faith rooted in daily experiences with angelic visitation. And I shared that quote because it reminds me of our sort of superiority, our modern superiority and sensibilities, that we think because we have certain things figured out in the modern day, that our understanding, our perspective, our conclusions as to what that might be are more accurate than conclusions or thoughts or beliefs held from our ancestors. We look down our noses at our ancestors as looking at them as superstitious, and it's all imaginary. I certainly took this point of view when I was studying the Bible growing up, that these were folks that just had experiences but translated them into these other into the language of their day, but clearly they either made them up or whatnot. We have these very provincial ideas about our ancestors, and I think it's really unfair to them, and it's also like flattening history. It's flattening the way human beings are in history, and it's robbing them of the same kind of agency and experience and connection to reality that we have now, and saying that our connection is somehow superior to theirs. I think that's a false, sort of assessment. Not to say that there aren't some conclusions that maybe are more accurate now than they were in the past, but just to have that kind of superiority, that sense of superiority to our ancestors, I think is a real stumbling block for us to understanding what this is. So I'm really grateful for Jacques and this work and able to push this conversation in a direction that it needs to go in looking at this from a more macroscopic level.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I remember reading that quote or elements of that quote in a previous episode we did. And yes, to that point, it's well taken. And I think we have to remember that even now there has been some suggestion, and actually Jacques was really pushing this notion in the late 70s, I think it was, that we might see a burgeoning religious movement underway, basically. And it's in the guise of flying saucers and non-human intelligence, extraterrestrials and whatnot. This is the point here, is that we can sometimes look back at history and think that, like you said, people made up funny stories or made up stories to try to make sense of their experience. Well, his point is that that still happens today, and that at one point he really thought we were going to see this massive global scale kind of movement towards a new religion around the Space Brothers. That, of course, has not happened. I think there's numerous reasons for that, one of them being that these very beings, first of all, might be many different kinds of beings. I would argue they are, but they also tend to deliberately operate at the fringes. So it becomes difficult to get clear on what the actual messages would be. And this is an ongoing question, is why is there so much, not necessarily disinformation, but seemingly nonsensical information from these beings? In fact, that's one of the things he gets into. Is that because they're trying to cloak from us their true nature? They just don't think we're ready, or because they're deceptive? what are the options there? I think we have to, again, be careful not to jump to conclusions, but keep an open mind and keep engaging. But on this point of just how groundbreaking this book was, let me just go through a bullet point list here of what this book tackled and how it tackled this topic differently and in a really revolutionary way that has changed ufology forever since then. So, his book, Passport to Magonia, which is subtitled From Folklore to Flying Saucers, first published, Nathan, in 1969. And that's truly amazing when you think about how groundbreaking it was, especially considering how old it is now. All right, so it shifted the focus from nuts and bolts ETs to folklore. At a time when most ufologists, as I pointed out earlier, were obsessed with proving UFOs as physical spacecraft from other planets, Vallée proposed they shared patterns with age-old fairy lore, religious visions, and supernatural encounters. He also introduced the paraphysical hypothesis. Instead of aliens from space, Vallée posited that UFOs might be part of a control system or interdimensional phenomena embedded in human consciousness or reality itself. As a quick aside, I know you and I talked about this before. This notion of interdimensionality was emerging at that time, and Vallée quickly leapt on that new notion in physics and in science to say perhaps that's what these beings are. Now, this also cataloged global historical cases. This is a key point. I actually reread this book this week so that I could be really up to date on it. And a huge part of the book is actually just going through all these encounters across time and the similar elements that emerge. So he brought legitimacy to centuries of strange encounters, including fairy abductions, mysterious aerial beings, and other mythic, quote-unquote, accounts, suggesting a potential continuity across culture and across eras that defied the modern ET narrative. In other words, this notion that it's a recent modern phenomenon. This also, of course, undermined the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which we should point out, Jacques, like many of us, began assuming that's what this was, but he quickly learned, again, to his credit, based on a close analysis of the data, that that was insufficient to explain the high strangeness. So he challenged the dominant ETH by showing its limitations. Example, why would aliens behave like tricksters or follow illogical patterns inconsistent with spacefaring scientists? Now, I know you and I have questioned that a little bit and pushed back a little bit, because how would we know how these beings should act, right? We have to be careful not to be anthropocentric there, but I at least take his point that they weren't acting like scientists as we would expect scientists to behave. Now, his book also blended data science with folklore. So a trained computer scientist, Vallée used cataloging methods and rigorous case comparison while still daring to integrate material from myth, anthropology, and psychology. He introduced cognitive and symbolic lenses, which you spoke to earlier. So instead of treating witnesses as simply observers of hardware, he framed experiences as symbolic, transformative, and sometimes manipulative. So in this book, alien abductions were recontextualized. And he points out that years before the abduction phenomenon exploded in the 1980s and 90s, he was already noting how similar these accounts were to changeling and fairy lore. Now, in a minute, I want to get to the control system theory, which is really central to his analysis and what he put forward that has been engaged with ever since. But let me get your feedback on those elements that he introduced in trying to get us to think about these matters differently.
Yeah, I think you, in that list, it really drives home how groundbreaking that analysis was, and how much it must have been difficult for him to take that particular tack, given the prevalence of the ETH view of the day. So I know the book probably got some mixed reception because of that take, but it has left an indelible mark on the study of this after its wake, and so. I'm very grateful to Jacques for being able to kind of stretch our minds a little bit in the way he approached this. And I think that it's a little bit more disconcerting in a way, right? Because this hypothesis challenges us to think, well, maybe this isn't a recent phenomenon. It's not something that's just happening, in the 20th century. Now that we can send rockets into outer space and, space becomes a little bit more accessible to humanity, so therefore maybe we're going to meet visitors from other planets. This whole notion of the solar system and planets and habitable planets and worlds, like all that stuff really didn't begin developing in a formal sense until the 20th century. But to then wrestle with this concept that, oh, it's been here a lot longer and it's more complicated than that, it really, I think, gets to some of our most deeply held understandings of what it means to be human. We have this notion that the Earth is this sort of untouched, sort of gem in the solar system that just developed life on its own, and it's been around for so long, and humans are the pinnacle of that evolutionary process and our intellect, our capacities. And to then challenge that really directly by saying, wait a minute, maybe this was all, part of a plan, a controlled plan by an intelligence that's not human at all, that's been interacting with humanity and the planet for a very, very long time. And that's not God, right? So this is the other component of Vallée's hypothesis. He's not saying there's just some sort of divine, actor here. He's saying there is another intelligence that's interacting with humanity, and we need to take that seriously. It's as real as you and I are real. It's not something that's just purely spiritual, like an intelligent designer, for example. So a really interesting departure, and I think it's funny to me how many folks sort of have been influenced by Vallée, or they take Vallée seriously or not very seriously. And as you point out too, I mean, we certainly have our own critiques of some of his takes, and I think it's worth re-examining some of these takes as we kind of go through them. But a huge, huge work here that we owe a great deal of gratitude to.
Okay, now let's touch on another key element. This is something that gets bandied about in UFO discussion in our community all the time. That's this notion of a control system that he postulated. So he was saying that UFO phenomena may be a mechanism for shaping human belief systems or perception, something far more subtle and complex than just contact with otherworldly visitors. And this speaks to what you said about this being potentially a bit disconcerting, because it certainly takes us off the throne. And if not cattle, it certainly puts us in the position of being a lesser species that is being openly trained, basically, and steered over time. Now, I would point out, as I have before, that I don't at all assume control system is nefarious in its nature. I actually think there is absolutely a control system. I've been saying for a while now that it's clear to me that this realm is being subsumed by other realms. And this speaks to ontology and the nature of what we're dealing with here. But to that end, because I do see all of this existence in the incarnational realm as a stage set for the evolution of consciousness, I do see it as a kind of control system. And furthermore, I am convinced that the events of our lives are arising purposefully. What is that other than a control system? But not necessarily a nefarious control system, not necessarily one that is trying to undermine our own agency. In fact, one of the really complex issues that Vallée doesn't get into, and probably is too much for us to get into in depth here, is this notion that we may be part of the control system on both ends. In other words, if it's really true, this notion, as has been postulated in some communities, that we ourselves are the ones that set up the events of our life so that they would be the catalyst for spiritual growth, then ironically, we are actually the agents of the control system as much as we are the recipients of it. So we can touch on the control system more in a second, but let me just say a couple other things he touched on. So yes, the notion here, to my point about this being a stage set for the evolution of consciousness, from Vallée's point of view, alien technology is itself stagecraft. And he suggested that some UFO events may be designed to appear technological to match cultural expectations, not necessarily because they are mechanical in nature themselves. Pretty provocative claim there. He definitely provoked backlash and reevaluation, and you touched on this. So many in the mainstream UFO community dismissed these ideas at the time. Others found them liberating. So all in all, Vallée pioneered a completely new paradigm, and he opened the door for later thinkers like John Keel, Whitley Strieber, and my friend Jeffrey Kripal. And that would allow us to explore consciousness, mythology, and the paranormal in relation to UFOs, which is definitely something you and I have championed on Liminal Phrames. So let me get your take on that. The idea that not are these just technological, but even the technology itself might be a bit of a ruse used for some deeper kind of intention.
Yeah, I think if you really wrestle with that statement, it's gonna throw you a curveball. right? Because we have this notion that, let's say, the tic-tac or the triangles, these craft that we observe in the sky, are in fact what it truly is. That it is a technology, and that's one take you could have of reading Vallée's book. That it's a technology that has been masking itself over time to humanity in different periods. But what this quote really is getting at is it may not be technological at all in the way that we think of technology, conventionally. It's just aligning with our understandings of reality in our day and how our reality is, and how we interact with it, how it's manipulated. We do that through technology, but it doesn't need to be technology in and of itself. And I think that's really stretches us a lot. You and we've tried to kind of push this notion that this could be rooted in a concept of idealism, and idealism is sort of making this claim that all is happening in the mind, that it may appear as a technology, but it's still happening in the root space of mentation, right? And so that's part of what we're getting at here, is that it may not be a mechanism at all. It may take on the appearance of one, because that appearance is allowing us some sort of, again, with that calibration concept that I gave before, it's allowing us an on-ramp to interaction, but it may not in fact be what it truly is. And you can think of this as from the standpoint of developmental phases as well. And you've touched on this a lot in our podcast. That humanity, in order for it to grow, from different stages over time, and to be what we know as human civilization today, we've had to embrace certain concepts that have pushed us outside of our maybe formerly tribal, kind of highly warlike, sort of solve everything through physical altercation civilization. We still do a lot of that, obviously, today, but we've largely managed to build a planet-wide civilization that is, for the most part, fairly peaceful. But that hasn't happened without the influence of some of these sort of higher thinking ideas. This, think about where our spiritual traditions come from, heavily influenced by what we would call now, paranormal or supernatural encounters that influence the writers, practitioners, believers of those traditions, to pushing them into different ways of interacting with one another. And so that hand, that kind of hidden hand, or maybe what we would think of as supernatural hand at certain phases, has really pushed us into a different way of being in our civilization than we might not have ever achieved. We might have killed each other off before we ever got there. But now it's pushing us even further, right? So it's pushing us beyond, I think, even our current understandings of what we think of as technology, and now inviting us, you mentioned with the psionics, inviting us to understand or consider the link between mind and craft, mind and experience. That's the sort of next leap that needs to occur. So this one concept really unlocks a whole host of things for me, and sort of understanding this, and challenges a lot of my initial assumptions about what this might be, as if it's just alien craft or just some sort of technological machine.
Yeah, and I like the point you made about idealism, because, of course, there's different ways you can engage with this conversation, and at different levels that you can enter the conversation. And depending on which level you enter at will open up different possibilities that can explain some elements more than other elements, whereas deeper levels perhaps allow for a conception that could make sense of all of it. And I think idealism definitely gets us there. Now, as you and I often talk about, we have to be careful to not just move towards cognitive simplicity because it's easier on us, right? This tendency towards reducing cognitive load happens all the time. And I think that's one of the major problems with our community, actually. But at the same time, when we wrestle with this notion of physicality versus trans-physicality or non-physicality, from an idealistic point of view, that becomes a much simpler conversation, because then you recognize that physicality, quote unquote, is just the presentation in our experience of a certain kind of phenomena, but it is not ontologically distinct from other elements of our consciousness. And while some people, again, push back against that and say, this table sure feels real to me. Well, number one, even physics will tell you that is mostly empty space and the coherence of fields, giving it the impression of physicality. But beyond that, we now recognize, even again from our cutting edge physics, that even things we think of as particles are really temporary. They're basically springing out of nowhere from antiparticles into particles for very short periods of time, but most of the time out of existence as part of this undifferentiated field, which starts sounding a lot like non-duality in our religious traditions. So once you start recognizing that if this is all consciousness, in other words, if everything is basically just mentation processes, then suddenly it makes complete sense that you would have fairies and ETs, Sasquatch, conversations with the dead, and all these different kinds of elements all arise as basically an extrapolation of this understanding that everything is ultimately different refractions of the same one being. So in that sense, when we encounter a being that frightens us, in the same way that we sometimes will have a nightmare that frightens us, but still being driven by this desire for integration from the deep self, basically. So the unconscious or the subconscious surfaces these elements that can shock us sometimes, can overwhelm us, can certainly frighten us, but it still be for the sake of this greater integration. In other words, it's happening for a reason. So I want to make that point because sometimes when people hear me say things are happening purposefully, that they think I think everything is sunshine and roses. Clearly it's not. And actually, I think a more robust understanding of synchronicity is that even things that arise that seem tragic on the surface can still also be arising synchronistically. And in fact, from this perspective of this being a stage set for the evolution of consciousness, we have more capacity to grow from those elements than from the things that seem warm and fuzzy. So there's numerous ways to attack this. And I think actually, I look at this from a more overarchingly idealistic perspective than Jacques tends to. And so it's easier for me to come to some of these conclusions and perhaps even go a step further. Because one point I like to make in here, and I know my friend Stuart Davis has made this point too, that sometimes just because a gray alien carries the basic same musculature and physiology as a fairy doesn't mean that it actually is the same being. So he has made this point, Stuart did. I like this analogy, that imagine you're sitting on this shoreline of this bay, and over time, across history, first you see a canoe. Then centuries later, you see a boat come in, like a fishing boat come in and go back out. And then even centuries beyond that, you see a nuclear submarine come into the bay and then go back out again. Just because those are showing the same basic behavior and some of the same basic morphology doesn't mean it's the same thing. So we have to be careful, again, not to be tempted here to reduce cognitive load and say this is all one thing manifesting in numerous guises. Ultimately, everything is one. So in a way, we are only interacting with ourselves over and over again. But we have to be careful not to, again, fall into this subject-object duality and say, we are ourselves, and that's one thing. And then there's these things we call the phenomenon that basically take on these different guises. And even people like John Keel have made that point, right? That in the super spectrum, he called it, it might just be one thing taking on numerous guises. I think I would want to take it a step further, and perhaps you would as well, and say that's all there is. That's true for us as well. We're as much a representation, an element, an extrapolation of that super spectrum as any of these beings that we call part of the phenomenon.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, maybe thinking of it in terms of, a diamond or a gem, right? It's one object, but as you turn it in your hand, it presents to you different facets and different reflections, different experiences. And so, yeah, ultimately it is one thing, but how it is experienced, and I guess I would even argue how it manifests is not, I think it's a mistake to say they're all the same being. This is where words get kind of tricky. And I think you're touching on this. I'm trying to articulate it as well. It is ultimately all one. It's all us. But the way in which it presents itself, we present ourselves to ourselves, can take on different forms, different clothing. It's like the puppet master, who has different, and that's the cover of the book, right? There's a hand that has these puppets on it, and one puppet is a demon, one is an alien, one is a fairy. The hand is ultimately source, but the characters take on different behaviors, different motivations, different, abilities. They manifest in different ways. So I think that's a difficult but important distinction to make. And I think it's challenging even if you look at it outside of the concept of ufology or fairy tales or folklore mythology. If you look at your fellow human being, your partner, your friend, your adversary, whatever it is, they're different from you. They have a clearly distinctive appearance than you, motivation from you, that their lived experience is different from your own. But ultimately, you and they are the same. You're all the same. So it's helpful to, I think, kind of put both of those lenses on, interchange them. Just like if you're at the optometrist and they, put the little lenses in front of your face and say, is it better with one or is it better with two? Better than one or better than three? You're switching between those different lenses to be able to see what you need to see at that chart across the room. So in the same way, you need to be able to switch between different lenses in how you interact with both the phenomena, but other human beings and just the reality that you find yourself in. But in order to see different facets of that ultimately underlying reality. So certain lenses help you see that reality in a better way than others. And certain lenses are more situationally appropriate. Like it's better to approach one situation with this particular lens than the same situation with another lens. So anyway, very, very interesting stuff. And I think it's incredibly valuable in trying to understand what this all is and get our arms around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking about a notion I discussed before that I think is relevant to what you're talking about there. Within this oneness, you have different levels of reality that manifest. And I picture them being like a series of interlocking Chinese boxes that kind of fold into each other. And the key element there is that each of those boxes and what's within them is self-consistent within that layer. So this is not to just flatten everything. That's not the point here. You can have a multitudinous kind of framework of reality, but it still ultimately also be oneness, right? So this speaks to non-duality, this notion that in the absolute sense, all there is the one. But the myriad forms arise as the flip side of that. And that within those myriad forms, you can have many different layers as well. So I think it's important that we clarify if we're speaking from the relative or the absolute perspective. In the absolute perspective, everything is undifferentiated consciousness. But in the relative state, there are many different levels. It need not just be one flattened level of phenomena. So in that sense, what we are in is basically like a virtual reality. Now, interestingly, Jacques penned this book in 1969. Since then, much more recently, and this came out as evidenced in his most recent diary that was published, basically, where he says now he sees a lot of compelling evidence suggesting we might be living in a virtual reality. If that, of course, is true, then that opens up many more possibilities and helps explain many of the diverse phenomena and the seeming high strangeness once you consider that. So it's interesting to see where he's moved since the time that he wrote this book. But all that said, let's finish with a discussion of two elements that do show up in both of these different traditions that at first are considered quite differently. So not only is he saying that fairies tend to look a little bit like gray aliens, but he's also saying the way they behave involves a lot of overlap as well. Even when it comes to things we have traditionally referred to as abductions, quote, end quote. So let's get into that. Let's talk about what happens both when people encounter what we used to call fairies, as well as what happens when people encounter gray aliens and the like. So what are the common features? Number one is missing time. So in the UFO encounter, abductees often report time lapses they cannot account for. When it comes to fairies, people are taken by fairies, literally, and they often return hours or days later, thinking only minutes have passed. This is part of the lore, that they will show up and people will say, where have you been? You've been gone for 3 weeks or 3 years. And to the person, it will feel like, 30 minutes or something. Another key corollary is around paralysis or a trance state. So in UFO encounters, abductees frequently experience paralysis before being taken. In fairy lore, victims are put into a trance or what is called fairy sleep before being transported. Then, of course, there's the notion of otherworldly beings front and center here. So in the UFO lore, beings are small often with large heads and eyes, often emotionless seemingly. Well, fairies are also small or ethereal beings with odd appearances, somewhat human-like, with exaggerated features. Okay, then there's a notion that I think is really interesting, the notion of the abduction happening to another realm or state of being. Because again, people who want to make this a technological modern thing being conducted by space aliens, I think have a hard time explaining how often people refer to this happening in a different state of being or a different kind of level of consciousness, or perhaps even a different realm. Again, within idealism, the question is, what is a realm other than another set of consciousness, basically? So in the UFO lore, abductees are taken into a ship, quote unquote, described as sterile, metallic, and brightly lit. In fairy lore, they're taken to fairyland, often described as a glowing subterranean or natural realm. Now there again, I think we should think about what Vallée is suggesting here, that they might be working with our expectations. So the question is, are abductees in the modern lore actually being taken to a sterile metallic place, or is that just what they're being shown? There are cases I'm aware of where actually they later find out that they're not actually in that clinical setting. And when they confront these beings and say, why did you show me that? They say, well, it's for your sake. We're trying to create more psychological comfort by showing something that you were expecting. So this is not just conjecture here. That apparently has happened, and some experiences have talked about it. Another couple elements, telepathic communication, common to both. So in UFOs, the beings rarely speak aloud. Communication is mental, mind to mind. The fairies often speak directly into the mind as well and communicate through feeling or music, interestingly. So let's talk about returning with altered perception or mission, a sense of mission. So returnees from UFO encounters report shifts in worldview, psychic sensitivity, and ecological awareness. In fairy lore, those who return often possess second sight, as it's called in that kind of mythology, healing powers, or prophetic visions. When you think about it, those are different terms for the very same thing. Then we have memory suppression or altered memory. UFO abductees often forget until dreams or hypnosis reveal the experience. In fairy lore, the memory is hazy or kind of enchanted, and details are often forgotten or are dreamlike. If there's one word I hear over and over again when I even look back at the materials that we're looking into with the Archives of the Impossible, it's dreamlike. That comes up over and over again with modern abductees. Trickster-like behavior. UFO entities often behave unpredictably. They seemingly are sometimes deceptive and contradictory in their actions, saying they're from some part of the cosmos that we later on find out seems nonsensical. The fairies are also notorious for mischief, deception, and confusing logic. And of course, overarchingly, in both cases, people don't want to talk about these things because of the high strangeness itself, because they seem so absurd in their nature. So we have UFO witnesses, they are reluctant due to ridicule or disbelief. And in fairy lore, even back then, in a century or two ago, people telling of these encounters risked further bewitchment or punishment from the beings, or mocking by people in their cultures. So a lot of overlap there, Nathan. What do you do with all that?
I think I ignore it. No, this is a lot to wrestle with, and the parallels are pretty jarring, quite frankly. So it does speak very much to this notion that whatever this intelligence is interacting with humanity in a way in which that specific individual, can have a meaningful interaction. Again, that calibration concept that I spoke to earlier. But some of the core components still remain, essentially the same. I think too that if you look back in our history, the relative selection rate for this kind of experience is probably roughly the same over time. It's not that everybody in the past had a fairy experience. Only certain people did. Some people did. They were touched, or they tend to come from a lineage that's often talked about as well. There's a lineage of people in their family who have experiences with the fairies. Well, that's also true with the abductions, right? So this isn't something that's happening, ubiquitously, even though in the past human culture may have been more comfortable assimilating those experiences into their, kind of tribal day-to-day narrative, right? Then we would be, right? At least I think that's probably true. So it's okay that they know that so-and-so and their family, have fairy experiences. They learn things from those places, and they come back and they share those experiences with the rest of us. And if we have questions from the fairies or, whatever, we might ask them to help get those answers. It's pretty different, though, than today, where people come to, the human family and say, I've been abducted, I've had this crazy experience. And we don't say, oh, that's great. Like, can you, ask them about this? Or can you, we don't carve out a safe space for that experience to coexist with our consensus reality. We instead have, really cordoned it off. Like, that's not possible. Doesn't happen. You are crazy. We've got a place over here called an asylum where we're going to send you. And we're not going to have to deal with you ever again. So we've not incorporated those experiences into our consensus reality in the way that our ancestors have. I also think about our shamanic traditions. I know you touched on that quite a bit. That cultures with strong shamanic traditions have similar kinds of experiences with non-human entities, but those experiences are incorporated into consensus reality for those traditions. So it's a lot to, I think, to wrestle with here, and at least for us as moderns to wrestle with this, because it's clear that these experiences are still happening, but we are not giving them a place in our consensus reality other than what we would call, crazy, abnormal, atypical. We don't want to deal with it. And I think that's something we've got to really, that's a legacy that we have to confront, and we have to figure out a way to redeem that and bring it back into our consensus reality.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And I wanted to also draw a parallel and a further extrapolation from something you pointed out there. Not only is there a lineage issue in both cases, right? Like you pointed out, that experiencers today often find that their parents and their grandparents had similar experiences, but that also is true of fairy lore. And it's also true not only just of families, but even of people with certain ethnic commonalities, right? So ironically, a lot of what we're pointing to here with fairy lore and whatnot has to do with Celtic tradition. Now, interestingly, people who have that as part of their ancestry today are also some of the same people that are reporting these encounters. So there's actually a through line there, not only between the commonalities between the types of accounts, but even the people and the ethnicity that might play a role here. Now, again, I want to make a distinction here because some people might say, aha, that proves that everything is physical and this is actually genetic in nature. And if you have a certain brain configuration, then you're more likely to have these encounters. But again, Donald Hoffman would point out to us all that your neurons aren't real. So in that sense, from an idealistic point of view, our brain differences are just one parallel, one mirroring of this deeper energetic truth. So in that sense, there are differences between people and they're consistent. Again, when you think about those self-consistent Chinese boxes, so things like genetics and science, those things work within themselves. They are self-consistent. That doesn't ignore the fact, though, that they're also at a deeper layer speaking of something else. So these can each mirror each other at these different levels, and they speak in their own kind of symbology and linguistic structures at those different levels. So when you're someone looking at a brain, thinking brain differences cause different experiences of reality, then you're going to find evidence of that. But of course, as you and I know, the hard problem of consciousness speaks to the fact that we find no way to take stuff and produce consciousness, take material stuff and produce consciousness. We see parallels, we see correlations between when something's showing up in a brain in terms of activity and experience, but not one that's causal in nature. So I think that's really, really fascinating. And it speaks to the fact that something is different about these people. The question is, what is different? I think here, for instance, of the fact that many people, as I pointed to earlier, would say that we ourselves are part of the control structure at another level. So at the oversoul level, we are actually orchestrating these events of our lives so that we will have certain opportunities for awakening, basically, and deeper integration. So if that's the case, then of course, we are going to take on a certain kind of brain configuration that's going to be consistent with the kind of experience as a human being we wanted to have in this incarnation. So as I pointed out before, I'm both-handed, and that means that my brain, the two lobes of my brain, function differently than most people. But I don't think that's actually causal. I think that that's indicative, another mirroring of the choice that I made from the oversoul level to have a certain kind of experience because of the opportunities that would allow me to engage with and catalytically grow from. So it's really interesting how you can approach these from different levels and they all make sense. And they all also fit within this series of interlocking Chinese boxes that are themselves self-consistent.
Yeah, I think it also is an invitation to us to, just like you can read a story, right? And you can really get engrossed in a novel, really love the characters, fall in love with them, and kind of see yourself in their shoes, right? It's the same invitation that we have in our day-to-day experience, that you, it's not only important that you can put yourself in the shoes of another person that you interact with, in the moment, right? Getting to greater understanding is always beneficial, in my opinion, by placing yourself in their shoes and their experience. But it's not just something that you're doing kind of metaphorically. We're talking about something that's something you literally are going to do, right? You and they are the same. And so that means that at some point in time, quote unquote, which we talked about quite a bit, this linear notion of time, you are them. You are having their experience. And that's, if not a great argument, I don't know what other argument there might be to say that, like, it's really important for you to treat others as you want to be treated, right? Because you are they are you. And so to have that kind of compassion and understanding, is really critically important. So it's a keen insight here that I think, and Passport to Magonia doesn't delve into all of these, different sort of areas, but these are things that kind of flow out from some of these conclusions that we can tease out from these insights that I think are really, really important to our conversation today, right? Because, as we kind of conclude the show, we've got to find a way. Our conversation about UFOs is getting pretty stuck, I think. And it's getting stuck between our fixation on the technology and then our kind of vague understandings and sensibilities towards what's broken in our consensus reality as it relates to our conscious experience, right? So we've gotten to a place where I think most people are going to say, yeah, there's a technology here, but it's also related to consciousness. And then we kind of have stopped thinking a lot from that point forward, and the conversation's gotten pretty stale. And we've gotten different factions that are going to push on one of those different levers. I want government disclosure, and that pretty much just means nuts and bolts technology. Or I want, psionic, I want the psionic to come to the forefront, the psychic abilities to come to the forefront. And if we can just tap into that, like think of the telepathy tapes here, we can tap into that ability, then, we can figure it all out. Well, it's not really either or. We've got to kind of figure out how both of those things work together. And I think Vallée is challenging us to really think in that way. And then how do you incorporate it into your lived experience? That's the real trick. And I don't have any easy answers for that. I just know that that's something that we've really got to confront if we want to push this forward.
Well said. And I think you're about closing with a couple different perspectives of friends of mine and how I see them both as having part of the puzzle. And here I think about Ken Wilber, and he often taught about the fact that different presentations of the truth are both true and partial. And we should be open to that, and we should be looking to transcend and include rather than supersede and reject. So on the one hand, I have abductee friends who were part of the phenomenon of the abduction phenomena that happened in the 1980s and 90s. And for those people, they desperately and understandably want this to be grounded in our reality. They want someone from a podium, someone from officialdom to say, we're sorry, we made fun of you, we mocked you, what happened to you was real. Absolutely. I understand that need to have that moment happen. I hope it does happen. On the other hand, I have other friends in academia who would argue that this is happening in an imaginal realm, that there's an imaginal interface with us here. And they would be hesitant to say this is happening as physically as perhaps some of these abductee friends would want to say. And I know there's been some rich and robust conversations from those different groups. I think, to your point, it's both and beyond. That the deeper invitation here is not to ask whether or not this is happening on the physical level or not, but it's to ask, what does physicality even mean to begin with? And to your point about the fact that we're different facets of the same diamond, what this basically comes down to is a collective immune disorder where we are fighting each other as an implication of the illusion of separation. And from that, you get the subset of the illusion of scarcity. So in the same way, I often describe it, that if I see a piece of cake and my right and left arm start fighting each other, clawing at each other to get that piece of cake, not recognizing it's going into the same body. That's true in the most overarching level, basically. So that's the deeper invitation here. And I think it's the more consequential one, because ultimately this new way of framing reality doesn't just change and open up new possibilities of how we think about technology, but it might address some of the most overarching concerns we have about the nature of our civilization, even the survival of our civilization, which of course is another key element that gets brought up in both these different fields over and over again.
Yeah, really well said. It makes me think of, in Christian tradition, this notion that, the eyes, the hands, the feet, these are different parts of the body, but they're all the body, and all equally important. You can't have a body without all of them doing what they do. And that's so true of the experiences that we have, which gives validity to not just UFO experiences, by the way, but to any experience. So this is another fallacy that we fall prey to, is we want to chase that UFO experience. And I've been guilty of that, certainly. Like, I want to see a UFO, I want to have an experience of some kind. If I don't have one, then this is less real to me for some reason. But any experience at all is amazing, incredible experience that lends, sort of strengthens this notion that reality is truly beautiful and deeper than we think it might be. So, incredible implications for us, for the community, for humanity. It just so happens to be that these fantastical concepts really do push us a little bit further, and I'm glad they do. And for those of you who've had those fantastical experiences, keep pushing us further, because they become these catalysts whereby we can not only understand the deeper reality, but reclaim the beauty of our day-to-day experiences, which is so important. So thank you all for listening. It's really been a great show and a good conversation. Looking forward to the future conversations ahead. And on that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, friends, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.